All right, folks, the numbers are starting to go up. I'm excited to see people virtually walking in to whatever room we're imagining we're having this in, this Feigenbaum Forum. And let me give you a chance to wander in and find your seat as the numbers keep going up, and then we'll get started here. Let's see. Love the tickers going up. We're over 60. We're expecting a good turnout today from folks. Not only, this is exciting because this is the era of Zoom, at least for now on these events. We have not only folks who would be able to join us on campus, we know we have folks registered, we have alumni registered, parents, as well as others just interested in the topic who have no affiliation with Union College. So excited to have everybody with us. So let me get started. Our ticker's slowing, so let me get started here. Again, welcome everybody to the Feigenbaum Forum. I'm David Harris, president at Union College. I'm once again hosting, happy to once again host this. This is my third Feigenbaum Forum. It's the 6th event in this annual series. Let me say a little bit about the series. I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about this evening, and then say a little bit about our speaker, our panelists, and of course some ground rules for how this is going to work. So this event was conceived of by brothers Armand Feigenbaum, who was class of 1942, and Donald Feigenbaum, who was class of 46. They were devoted alumni and longtime benefactors to Union College. They were world leaders in systems engineering and total quality control. They founded the General Systems Company in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. It's an engineering firm that designs and helps implement operational systems for corporations and governments around the world. The Feigenbaums became titans of their industry because they understood the importance of constantly and creatively innovating. After their passing, the foundation made a very generous gift of $11 million to Union College to honor the brothers' legacy. This gift included an endowed professorship in behavioral economics, scholarships, a gift to support the renovation of the Visual Arts Building, which is now known as the Feigenbaum Visual Arts Building, and the funding for this event, the Feigenbaum Forum on Innovation and Creativity. This forum provides the college with the opportunity to welcome nationally and internationally recognized speakers who've revolutionized their fields. It's in the spirit of the legacy of these two entrepreneurs and leaders that we use this forum each year to bring ideas and information to our community. So given the events of the last 14 months, I thought that this would be the perfect year to focus on ourselves, to focus on Union, to focus on peer schools in the liberal arts and liberal arts colleges. The pandemic has required individuals and organizations to be innovative and creative as a fundamental aspect of human existence. Face-to-face interactions has been minimized or eliminated. Arguably, no sector has been required to exhibit more innovation and creativity than residential higher education. Our institutions, many of which have operated with the same basic model for decades, if not centuries, have been forced to suddenly pursue our goals with many fewer people learning, living, and working on campus. So what were the most successful innovations? What did we learn from this experience? What have the forced experiments at schools across the country taught us about what should change and what should not if liberal arts colleges are to thrive in the future? So shortly, I'll ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. But you know, I feel really lucky because I got to pick the panelists. So I thought I would just tell you just a little bit about why I'm so excited they said yes and so excited to have this conversation with them this evening. So Joshua Kim, along with his collaborator, Edward Maloney, Joshua published a widely read article in April 2020, 15 fall scenarios. Everyone was reading this, everyone was talking about it, as we were all trying to figure out, what are we gonna do when we can't have classes face-to-face? That article, which just reflects the kind of thoroughness and creativity in his work, books, articles, you can see, you'll get a sense of that this evening as well. And I have to note, because this is also an important thing to me, he's a sociologist and a demographer. So that's always important to note from yet another sociologist demographer. Mary Beth LeBate. So until January, Mary Beth was president of the Commission on Independent Colleges and Universities, otherwise known as CICU, and as such had a unique perspective on how private colleges and universities in New York State reacted to the pandemic. We fared as well as we did in New York because of the advice and advocacy that Mary Beth provided. She's really one of these unsung heroes of higher ed in New York over the last year. So excited to have her here with her perspective. Brian Rosenberg. I had a pleasure of meeting Brian a couple of years ago. We were at an event, National Press Club, and in July of 2020, timing is everything. He stepped down as president, or June, I guess it was, as president of Macalester College after 17 years in the role. He's outspoken, creative, and since he's now teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, he can finally share what he really thinks. So we will see. And then Jeff Selingo. Jeff's one of the most respected journalists and authors writing on U.S. higher education, has been for a long time. He spent 16 years at the Chronicle of Higher Education. He's the author of several books, and he's the host of the Future You podcast, amongst many, many other roles. So I'm really excited. You can see we've got a range of perspectives here. Now, before we begin our conversation, I'm going to share a few housekeeping notes. First, today will be an opportunity for you to ask questions and share feedback. I want to thank everyone who sent questions in ahead of time. We have a bunch already, but it's not too late. If you want to share questions with us, I ask you to put your question in the Q&A feature. Click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Due to the number of people who are with us, microphones are muted, so we won't be able to have people speaking and be seen, but we will get to as many of these questions as we can. I'm really excited about this. Look forward to leading the conversation. I'm going to spend some time up front leading conversation with the panel, and then we'll turn to your questions. So with that lead up, let me start off and ask my panelists to just say a little bit about themselves. So in the order you're on my screen, at least. Mary Beth, you just want to say a little about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Mary Beth LeBate. First of all, thank you, President Harris, for asking me to be on this. So I, as David said, I was the head of a trade association that had all the private colleges in it. I think the most important thing that when I think about higher education, what I think about is I was a first generation student, and college changed my life, as I'm sure it did for many of you. So every ounce of my energy has been focused on really giving that opportunities for others, because I've seen what it can do. And place like Union, I mean, I'm local to the area. Place like Union has always just been, just really stellar on what it can do for not only the community, but for students. So thank you for this opportunity to be on the panel.
And Mary Beth also brings a lot of experience in state government, having served for a long time there as well. So we're getting multiple different perspectives from Mary Beth. Josh, Kim, you want to go next?
Sure. It's a real honor to be here with you, President Harris, and it's very exciting that you're President Harris now, so we can talk about that and with this panel. So at Dartmouth, I'm the Director of Online Programs and Strategy, and that's kind of an interesting job to have at a liberal arts institution that's been around since 1769 that doesn't really know if it wants to have online programs and strategy. And suddenly during COVID, I became more popular than I ever was. And we'll see when COVID ends if I go back to where I was before. So it'll be interesting to talk about, at Union College, where you're thinking about online learning at all. If it fits for a residential institution, we can talk about that. I'll say that I also bring to this, kind of like how Mary Beth brought her kind of being a first generation student. I'm a dad of my younger daughter's a junior in college, and my older daughter is first year graduate student. So, when I think about my work, I often think about it through the lens of being a dad and my daughters.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. And I keep saying there's a piece I need to write called A Dad and a President. So it's really interesting. I have two daughters college age throughout this whole experience as well. So Brian?
First, David, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I spent my entire career up until now in various roles at liberal arts colleges, 15 years as an English professor, and then 5 as a dean, and then, as you said, the last 17 as a college president. So I've been pretty immersed in this world for a long time. The interesting thing about my current situation is that I'm experiencing two dramatically different incarnations of higher education. As you mentioned, I'm spending time at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but I am also spending a lot of my time as senior advisor to the president at the African Leadership University, which is in about every way possible the polar opposite of Harvard. And I'd be happy to talk about which of those things I find more interesting at some point in this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brian. And Jeff?
First of all, David, thank you for the invite. It's great to be on this panel of people that I've known for a while and really respect their work. So it's great to be here. It's interesting from perspective of where we come to this work. I pinch myself often that I'm doing this. As I mentioned before we got on air tonight, when I was 18 years old, I went to a high school where barely 50% of the students even went to college. My mother didn't go to college. My father was a high school music teacher. When I would get mail from college, I wanted to be a journalist. As I told the group earlier, I would look on the back, and if the college didn't offer journalism as a major, I thought, well, that's not for me, because, you know, I thought to be a journalist, you had to major in journalism. I was very lucky to get to where I am today after working in and around higher education for more than 20 years. I just published a book there about a year inside college admissions, Who Gets In and Why, where I was embedded in the admissions process at 3 colleges and universities, and really saw it from both sides, not only from inside the admissions office, but also from what students and parents and the public at large want from our colleges and universities, and what I think is a changing value proposition as college becomes a very expensive item, as family income stagnates, and as we continue to ask the question about what we get out of the experience after 4 years. In addition to writing, I'm also a special advisor at Arizona State University to President Michael Crow there, who has really built a very different model of higher education on scale and on serving really the needs of that state. So we hopefully will talk about what I think higher education might look like in 10 or 15 years based on some of the work that I've done there and at other institutions as well. But great to be here tonight.
Thanks. And I don't think you mentioned, but you're also a trustee, as you said.
Yes, I am a trustee not far from where you are at Ithaca College in upstate New York, where I was an undergraduate journalism major.
Excellent. Another Liberty League school. So it's great to have those perspectives as well. So hopefully you have a sense of why I'm so excited about this group and this conversation. I'd also note, when we think about the opportunities to make change, this is a rare opportunity. And from the time I started as a senior administrator in the sort of 15, 16 years ago, every once in a while I'd think, if you could just pause the college for a few years, you could actually change things that need to be changed. But the problem is, from the students at least, it's only 25% of them leave each year. Faculty, even less turnover. But we have this chance now that, as I've been saying to folks, next spring term, we're in trimesters, only 25% of the students at Union will have ever experienced a non-COVID spring term at Union College. So whatever we do, a lot of folks will just think is normal. So it's really a rare opportunity. It's why I'm so excited about the conversation and thinking about this. So I want to organize this first part of the conversation really in 3 parts. It's sort of the before, during, and after, if you will. So the before. So I think it's really important to get a sense of what were the challenges and opportunities liberal arts colleges were facing before any of us knew what COVID was. Certainly everything wasn't smooth sailing and easy going. There were a lot of challenges. Here at Union, I talked about it as headwinds that we were all facing. So I might start off and just ask, what kind of challenges were you seeing? Jeff, maybe wonder what your thoughts are because you conceived of this book, obviously pre-COVID. So what kind of challenges were you seeing?
Well, I think one of the big challenges was around this value proposition. There was a big change around the last recession, the Great Recession in 2008, where students and parents started to ask even more so about what they were getting out of a 4-year education, and really started to look at the return on investment, particularly around jobs and pay. And we all know that going to college is a lot more than about jobs and pay, but as college prices continue to rise, family income stagnated, and of course, during the Great Recession, people lost their houses or lost a lot of value in their houses, which of course they were using to pay for college tuition, they started to ask what they were getting out of it. And it was at that time in the annual survey that UCLA does of college freshmen every year that really for the first time in a long time, college freshmen said the number one reason to go to college was to get a job. And then what we saw in the decade past, so this past decade since 2008, 2009, is really a flight away from the humanities. In fact, President Rosenberg and I talked about this for an Atlantic article a couple of years ago, where even at more selective liberal arts colleges and research universities, we saw this big decline in traditional humanities majors as students started to flock even more, for example, to STEM fields and other fields that they saw as essentially pre-professional that would get them that job after college. Now, what is interesting about this is that it really flies in the face of everything that we hear from people in hiring roles, from the work that I did for my last book about There Is Life After College, about the skills that people are looking for, especially in first jobs, really speak to, I think, the value of a broad liberal arts education. So we have this very big disconnect between what the signals the employment market seem to be telling us around skills that they want and where parents and students are voting with their feet. And that to me was the big challenge one of the big challenges before the pandemic for liberal arts colleges.
Excellent. So Brian, you experienced this. You said you're 17 years as president. I wonder how your sense of, from one school, from your perspective, these changes. Were you seeing this difference, this increasing focus on value proposition, challenges for the humanities, shift towards STEM? What were you observing?
One of the challenges of going after Jeff is he's so complete. So in immediate answer to that question, yes. So in the last 5 years that I was at Macalester, we saw what I would describe as a kind of tectonic shift toward the STEM disciplines, applied mathematics, computer science, and to some extent economics, and a shift away from many of the traditional humanities disciplines. And that was not the case when I arrived. The percentage of students at Macalester majoring in the STEM disciplines was under 20% when I arrived. It was 50% when I left.
Wow.
So that sort of describes in concrete terms what Jeff is talking about. For me, the two overriding challenges pre-COVID, and they've only been exacerbated by COVID, I think, were the financial model, which is simply not sustainable long-term for the vast majority of institutions, and demographics. I think most of us at this point are unfortunately familiar with Nathan Graw's term, the demographic cliff. We're looking at a situation 3 or 4 years down the road, particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest, where so many of these colleges are concentrated, in which there'll be a dramatic decline in the number of high school graduates. And many of these colleges, as you know, are already struggling with admissions. So just take the current situation, subtract 15%, and that's the future situation. So the flight from the humanities, the economic model, and demographics are three things that for me were top of mind.
All right, so I want to get to our other panelists, but I cannot resist, Brian. If you said went from 20% to 50% in a relatively short period of time, of course, in colleges you have tenured faculty members. So presumably, the faculty members in the humanities and social sciences were not teaching the STEM majors, at least in their fields, in their majors. So how are you handling this at Macalester? Did you grow the faculty? What happened?
We tried our best not to grow, at least dramatically. We did take advantage of opportunities like retirements or departures to shift some lines. So every time a line opened up at Macalester, it went to a committee, and then that committee made a recommendation to the provost. And so we did pretty significantly increase the size of the faculty in areas like applied mathematics and computer science. We saw some shrinkage, not dramatic shrinkage, in areas like languages, French and German, a little bit in history and English. But it's a problem. I mean, it's a challenge. You have a workforce that's highly specialized and not easy to move around, and you have dramatic shifts in student demand. And those things don't match up very well. And it makes it challenging to manage both the finances at a liberal arts college and to meet student demand.
So I know we're going to come back to that as we talk about what the future is, because as Jeff said earlier, we firmly believe, I do, I'm sure, and we guess all of you do, is look, the breadth you get at liberal arts college is really important, but how do you manage this given these factors? So Mary Beth, you're in Albany, you're working with the state, you're working with all of us pre-COVID. What are the big challenges that you're hearing from me and all of us? And what are you hearing on the other side from the government and other actors?
Absolutely what my colleagues have said, demographics are not on our side. The only states that are looking at an increase in college, high school student graduates are California, Texas, and Florida. So if you're a school that tends to recruit regionally, you're going to struggle. Financially, absolutely. And I think what people don't always recognize is this difference, which those in the business certainly know it, the difference between sticker price and what a student is actually being charged. So what you hear in a political realm is it's how can you charge so much? No wonder why students are rebelling and not going. No, they have to go to public colleges because they're never going to be able to afford it. And there's really not, at least amongst those who aren't trying to send their kids to school, there's not a recognition of our financial model, which essentially has the few who can afford the sticker price helping those who cannot. And what I say to especially elected officials, especially liberal elected officials who kind of come at me and will say, why are your colleges so expensive? Why can't you be as inexpensive as here in New York? We have very inexpensive public universities in SUNY and CUNY. And I say to them, it's not as if the public sector has found the golden solution on how to be more efficient. It's simply that they are covering their costs through a taxpayer subsidy. So I think that whole image of us being overpriced, being elite, that's been a challenge. And then of course, all of the talk, and I'd say some of it hyperbolic, about debt. You hear a lot about student borrowing. And instead of it being viewed, first of all, the notion that everyone is graduating after 4 years with $100,000 in debt simply isn't correct. And the notion that investing in yourself is not a good investment is also troubling. But I do think it all comes at the psyche and really creates a challenge for colleges to really counter those narratives.
Excellent, thanks. And then one of the things, you raise in your comments, it's one of my great frustrations. Jeff, we talk about how, we both started off in journalism and you stuck with it. I did not. At least I was there 3 weeks undergrad, but that was it. Is journalism often sort of misses the heterogeneity of higher ed. And so Mary Beth's talking about all the different schools that she worked with. How many schools was it in New York State, roughly, Mary Beth?
110 private not-for-profit colleges.
A story of private colleges, universities in New York, right? There's many scores of stories, if not 110 stories.
Right.
That gets lost. All right, so Josh, you have this really interesting role, as you said at the setup, is you're not at Southern New Hampshire, you're not at Arizona State, you're at Dartmouth. And sort of pre-COVID, talk a little bit about those challenges and how your role was connected to those things.
Sure. I think that I want to kind of answer this broadly, and then I can come to my role. The narrative pre-COVID about higher ed has been kind of one of crisis, one of the demographic cliff, of rising student debt, of all these kinds of issues. And I don't think that was the right narrative. Right before COVID hit, my co-author, Eddie Maloney, and I, who's at Georgetown, we published a book, Learning, Innovation, and the Future of Higher Education. And in that book, we tried to argue one of the big stories, and largely missed by, we think, journalists, is a renaissance in learning going on across colleges and universities for the last decade or so, as we learn more about learning science, and as we've really invested in advancing the student experience. David, if you compare our experience in college, going to class with what we now offer our students, you can't compare it. Like the classes are so much better. I know Union College did a lot of investment in looking at foundational classes and gateway classes and really redesigning those courses. So to connect that, in my role is it has online learning in the title, but I don't actually really care about online learning. I look at online learning as a mechanism to improve all of teaching and learning, kind of like a Trojan horse. So what's really important is if we can get non-faculty educators, people who are trained in learning science, working with faculty on course redesign, particularly say large enrollment classes, which we know disproportionately, students who are first generation or haven't had all the resources going in, they come in saying they want to major in STEM, and then they really come out in those gateway or classes. Those are the courses that I think need to be redesigned. We were seeing that quite a bit pre-COVID. We're starting to see that renaissance. I think the question is, will we be able to kind of build on that coming out of this experience in COVID?
Excellent. Thanks. All right. So, and folks, feel free to jump in and question each other as well. So let's talk to the during. So it's March, first 2 weeks of March 2020. And, Brian, there I was, there you were. And all of a sudden, as I said to folks, this 225-year-old institution was going online with 2 weeks notice. So we were trying to figure out, as it was happening in day by day, it was first everybody go home, end of term. Then it was, we're going to do finals online. Then it was, we're not coming back for spring term. And then it was actually employees, all but the most essential of essential employees. You're not here either. All of a sudden, we're an online school. So the question is just out there to anyone, when you look around at schools, where'd you see creativity, innovations? What kind of things did we observe over the course of the last year plus?
Well, in some ways, David, I think that this has been one of the most creative periods in the history of American higher education. Think about all the things that, one of the big things that I've always talked about is the academic calendar, right? Which I feel has been chiseled in stone and brought down from high on the mountains. And every time this comes up at faculty meetings about making any changes to the academic calendar, it might take years if it ever happens. And on a dime, we changed the academic calendar at many places. We changed breaks around. Somebody once told me recently they think spring break at their institution as always defined might be over for good, and they might rethink that. This idea of having different cohorts on campus at different times, so the idea of a low residency option. This idea now that we could do some work off campus, that we don't have to have all these employees, especially that are not student-facing employees, on campus, and now we've discovered new ways and perhaps more efficient, perhaps less costly ways of doing the work on campus. I mean, just go across the campus and we've discovered new ways of doing work, serving students, and overall operations. The question to me now is, what snaps back, right? I think there is, in all of our lives right now, right? Everybody wants to, take down that mask, walk around, walk in, eat in a restaurant. We're all dying to get back to kind of that old normalcy. And one fear that I have is some of the good stuff needs to come back, obviously, on college campuses. But one fear that I have is that in this desire to return to some sort of normalcy, that come fall, if there is more normalcy on college campuses, all that we've learned over the last 15 months will be lost. Or at least the good stuff might be lost in this desire to get back. And I know that there are some institutions who are trying to think about this, trying to, in some ways, almost create an oral history of the last 15 months so that they learn what worked and perhaps worked better so that they can keep it going forward. That's one thing that I'm concerned about right now in terms of snapping back.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff. What others? What'd you see? What'd you observe in the last year?
David, I'd give a shout out. I don't know if you call this innovation, but I want to give a shout out to higher ed, particularly at the very beginning of this. I think, at least I can speak for colleges in New York, we understood that something big was coming. And I think we reacted a little more quickly than a lot more quickly than a lot of industries. In many cases, we reacted more quickly than government and kind of pushed government along. I mean, I remember in late February getting calls from schools saying, we think we have to bring back our international students. We think it's too dangerous to be in Italy and China. And me letting people know, policymakers know, kind of as a courtesy, that we were going to do that we've kind of surveyed the situation. We think it's something that we got to get kids home. And it was kind of suggested, we don't want to panic people. Why would you do that? So, but I think higher ed, because we're independent thinkers, we did what we needed to do. So to me, that in of itself was innovative, being willing to make those tough calls really early on. I think the other thing I saw during that I think is I was very heartened by is the amount of collaboration between colleges. You had colleges talking who I don't think used to talk all that much, and you had colleges lending. It's a competitive world that you all live in, and the colleges you lead. But you had colleges lending expertise and advice where I don't think those conversations were going on at all. So if we can now convert that collaboration into some different models in the post-COVID world, I think that's a real good gain.
Yeah, and I think part of it for me, at least as a president, Brian, I'll turn to you next, is I always say that that parents entrust us with what's most important to them in the world. And I think this was a rare case in which, I didn't get into this thinking that I have to deal with these questions, but it was really life and death you're worried about, because it wasn't just people coming to your store, it's people who live there as well. And so I think that, at least here, another president I talked to, was what drove us to be aggressive. Brian, what did you see in the last year?
Well, just to reinforce Mary Beth's point, if you think way back to the first part of March of 2020, when the world really changed, the first dramatic signs of the change were sports leagues and colleges and universities. Within a period of just a few days, the NBA shut down, and then Harvard and Amherst said, we're sending everybody home. And I know from talking to Larry Bacow that he was very aware of the signaling power of a place like Harvard. Harvard sending everybody home, that reverberates. And so I really do give higher education a lot of credit for taking this seriously before a lot of other people did. And to echo Jeff's point, this has shown what actually happens when a whole bunch of really smart people are forced to innovate. There's a saying that someone I work with right now has, that constraint drives innovation. And all of a sudden, we were surrounded by constraint. And so the amount of innovating and adapting that colleges and universities did in a very short time was really pretty remarkable. But I do wonder with Jeff, how much of that will stick. I think there are a lot of things that we have learned during this time that should influence the way that we think about ourselves going forward. But the urge to go back to the pre-times is going to be really, really strong.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so David, I am going to ask you in a minute to put on your sociological hat, because it's clear that COVID both exacerbated and revealed structural inequalities in higher education. And I think we need to talk about that. But to be positive for a minute, I think that the biggest innovation was not academic continuity and remote learning, was not remote work. It had nothing to do with technology. I actually think the biggest innovation, the one that I hope we carry over, is that we developed this pedagogy of care, where we really understood where our students are living and the challenges they have, and particularly the faculty, but really everyone at our institutions. We were all in to helping our students get through this incredibly difficult time. And I think we interacted with our students in a different kind of way. We more co-created the learning. We did everything to try to support them. And sometimes we got rid of the things that didn't really help the students. And I think that understanding of the social determinants of learning kind of pervaded across now our institutions. And I'm very much hoping that when we come back, we still really think about the challenges that our learners have and focus our energies on the learners with the least resources, the most complicated lives. And if we can make it work for them through universal design for learning, through other supports, it will work for everyone else. So that's what I'm really hoping we bring out of this.
Excellent, excellent. Let me go to the last part, and then I'm going to open up the questions from the group here, the audience. We have over 100 folks who are watching with lots of questions coming in. All right, so here's the big question. So what should we look like in the future in liberal arts? So what should we keep? What should we dispose of? And what are the impediments to doing so? So Brian, you have the luxury now. I know you're teaching a class. I think it's what, the future of liberal arts, I think you said. So what do you think? Liberal arts colleges in the future, what are the keys?
Well, I don't have a blueprint for the liberal arts college of the future necessarily, but one of the things that has become top of mind for me, one of the questions I wrestle with a lot is this one: why is it so difficult for higher education to change in truly transformative ways? Every institution out there just about has in its mission statement a line about the transformative power of higher education. And yet when I look at the changes that we are enacting, and I don't deny that some of them in pedagogy, in the makeup of our student bodies, in the services that we provide, are meaningful and real. But I don't hear us trying often enough to take a step back and say, what do we really want to accomplish? What do we want the impact of our work to be? And is the way we are doing it having that desired impact? So that, for instance, to Josh's point, the inequities embedded in the higher education system in the United States are profound. And we're not going to solve them with small changes. And so my biggest concern and my biggest intellectual interest really is, what is it about higher education as an industry, as a sector, that makes change so difficult? Why are reputations so immutable? Why are academic structures essentially the same as they were 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, when that's true in almost no other industry? And so until we wrestle with that question of why it is that it is so difficult for us to change, I think it's going to be hard for us to change.
So let's say, assuming we can do it, what are the things you think we ought to do, folks?
Well, if it were up to me, I would become much less compartmentalized and siloed. Higher education is among the most siloed industries in existence. It is not unusual for a liberal arts college with 120 faculty to have 25 departments. I don't think that's serving students well. I don't think it's serving the financial model well. And I don't think it's necessarily consistent with the way students learn or the world they're going to move into. Look, I was an English professor for 15 years. I'm not sure that I can defend the English major as the ideal way that a student should organize her learning, unless you want to be an English professor. And so I'd like us to take a look at things like whether the current departmental and major structure is really what we should have going forward.
Well,
I think that's a great point, right? We have basically replicated a single model at many of our institutions of higher education. So we've taken this model of these are the majors we should have. We map the majors against the departments because that's how we organize the faculty. Yet students want to learn across majors, and we know the future of the world is cross-disciplinary. So I agree with Brian on that in terms of changing on that front. Second, and I see we're seeing some of this in the Q&A. We know the liberal arts and the values of the liberal arts and the skills of the liberal arts are sought by employers of all kinds, but so are very specific hard skills that unfortunately either students coming out of liberal arts colleges don't have, or they don't know how to talk about them to employers. And so what are those skills that, by the way, don't require a major or a minor? They, as Burning Glass Technologies, as Matt Singelman at Burning Glass Technologies will talk about often, they might require one course. They might require a 2-hour class where you could get some sort of badge or micro credential. Could we add those into the 4-year experience so that we unlock millions of jobs that could be available to liberal arts college graduates by just giving them a set of skills that people in pre-professional programs at other universities might have, and kind of combine them with the strong liberal arts skills that are highly sought after by employers. So those are the two things that I would do, following on to Brian's suggestion, and then adding these really specific hard skills in micro credentials.
Excellent, thanks. And here at Union College, one of the things we're looking at is a residential curriculum, which is one way in which we could, I like to say the average student, if you take the amount of time they're in class or studying, if you take the amount of time they're sleeping, I just like to say you assume those are mutually exclusive, because you got 49% of their time unaccounted for on average. And so the question is how to use a residential curriculum to have to get at some of those things you're talking about without overscheduling every minute of a student's day. So Josh and Mary Beth, what other things do you think are key as we think about the future here for liberal arts colleges?
Sure. So I do think we have to distinguish from from the large ecosystem to, a Union College or a Dartmouth College. In the large ecosystem, it's clear we need to invest more money in our community colleges and public education. Like that's clear, and we need to reverse the trend towards disinvestment. I think we all have a role to play in that. At the level of a Dartmouth College or a Union College, I think coming out of COVID, we need to really think about what we're doing in terms of investing in learning and investing in student success. During COVID, we've gotten a really good understanding, a much more thorough understanding of how complicated the lives of many of our students are, because we came into their homes, right? We saw this when our students come to campus. It's kind of a leveling effect. They stay in the residence halls, they have the same classrooms, and I think that kind of the challenges that many of our students had to navigate got kind of it was hard to surface. But now we really understand. So as we come back, I think we have to make a decision that if our students are not doing well, particularly in the foundational classes, and that's where students really tend to have trouble in the first 2 years, say in the calculus class or the organic chemistry class or whatever the really difficult class, that we can't assume anymore that, oh, they're just not living up to what they should be doing. We should assume that they're doing everything and they just have real challenges, that we can make targeted investments. So I think going into this, we have to sort of not accept the status quo before, where we lost so many students, first generation students, underrepresented minorities in particularly STEM fields, and we need to make those investments. It's kind of a moral issue now that's very clear coming out of COVID.
Yeah, one of the things I loved when I was back at it's one of my previous schools, can't remember which one now, is we're looking at the percent of students who got a discouraging grade in a gateway course. And you look at students of color, which is the focus I had, it was a shockingly large percent who, but if you look at white males, right, it was also a shockingly high percentage, which then should lead us to turn the mirror on ourselves and say, hold on a second. If you're admitting all these students to this exceptional school and a high percentage of them are getting discouraging grades in a gateway course, maybe it's us. Maybe it's not just them. So I think, Josh, some of it's going to help us think about some of those issues. Mary Beth, what else are you seeing as we think about future?
I think it's a lot should be focused on meeting the students where they are. And for all the reasons that we've been discussing, I want to be an English major, but I also need a job at the end of the day. I don't have the luxury of studying English or history for the sake of studying history or English. So, and I think for decades, higher ed has created the model and people have flocked to it. Students have flocked to it, and you accepted that model. And I think we're at that turning point now where colleges have to start molding their model to fit the student. And I think students now, because of COVID, are much more aware of what they want. So I want this major, but I need I need room to study some of the hard skills. I want an engaging classroom experience, but I really don't want to live on campus. I can't afford to live on campus. And I think we need to, more than ever, listen to the customer. What does the customer want? Instead, maybe your most elite schools can continue to say, here's what I'm offering, come get it. But I think the vast majority of us, and even if it's not, we don't need it because we need to get students, but just to give the students a better experience, need to step back and say, what is the student asking for, and how do I have to change to give the student what they need and what they're asking for?
Excellent, thanks. We're going to turn to our panelists, but to our audience. This is something I know we'll get questions about, and something we talk about at Union all the time. So I like to say that when you think about higher ed, we really do three things: creation of knowledge, dissemination of knowledge, and then knowledge-based policies, practices, and so forth. That's what we do. The percent focus varies across types of schools and people at schools. We've largely focused in this conversation on education. But of course, there's scholarship, which is an important piece of what happens at colleges. And so, we talk about students and understanding them better. We've also learned to better understand our faculty and staff, I think, and their needs and challenges. So when you think about the future of a liberal arts college with respect to the creation of knowledge, I wonder if you think about that differently, and we need to think differently about our emphasis on scholarship and research and so forth.
Well, I think several people have made this point already, but it's a very diverse ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And so there's not one model that equally suits every institution. So, they're clearly at places like Ivy League universities, knowledge creation plays an essential social function. I mean, we've seen it during the pandemic, the role that research universities have played in helping to come up with a vaccine, helping to deal with the pandemic. And so clearly at places like that, research, the creation of knowledge is a crucial function. That's just not true in the same way at a community college, mm-hmm. Where the focus is much more on teaching, on working with non-traditional students, working with students who are at risk. So there's not one model that suits everyone. I do have a concern that we went through a period for a long time when more and more liberal arts colleges were trying to emulate research universities. And so we came up with sort of what's been called the university college, where the curricula, the teaching loads, particularly at the better resource liberal arts colleges, began to be designed in emulation of research universities. And I'm not sure that has served the students at those institutions especially well. And I think one of the things we might see, in answer to your previous question going forward, is a shift back at many smaller institutions to a more exclusive emphasis on teaching as a way of distinguishing themselves from large research universities.
David, the other model that not only do we have this research model that Brian was talking about, but we also have this model that we think education happens to young people and in a physical place when we think of education. But yet, you were talking about the media and how the media thinks of institutions. It's also how they think about students, right? The average student today is not an 18-year-old. It is what we used to describe as non-traditional students or today's traditional students, right? They're students who, went to college and stopped out at some point. And this goes a bit back to Mary Beth's earlier point about debt. That's the big problem with debt, are students who start college and don't finish and have debt, and now not necessarily a job because of their college education. So to me, how do we build models that serve the lifelong learner? Adults who never went to college at all, adults who started college but never finished. And then, by the way, the massive amounts of all of us who went to college, graduated, got master's degrees, other professional degrees, and so forth, and are now going to need upskilling and reskilling throughout the rest of our lives. To me, that's a huge market for institutions to serve, because if they don't serve them, if traditional higher ed doesn't serve them, there are plenty of others, including the Coursera's of the world and LinkedIn Learning and other entities around the world, who are more than happy to serve what they see as a growing need for education. And now some people might say that's training. We could debate that at a separate time, perhaps, throughout the rest of your life.
So I'm going to keep moving because I see a bunch of these questions. So question number one is question number one on many people's minds. I think Jeff wrote like a whole book on it, I suppose. But how is college admissions going to change? What do we think? You know, so many schools, we were already test optional. A lot of schools went test optional. One school that I'm aware of basically said, we're not going to look at your senior year grades because it's COVID and so forth, and it's just too hard to know. How is it going to change this year? And I might be a little bit early. We'll see what schools have learned from processing applications this year. But thoughts, folks? How is college admissions going to change after the pandemic?
Well, I do think one of the things that might stick is, and I hope it does, is the decreasing importance of standardized testing. I think that schools are realizing that particular data point is actually not particularly necessary when you decide about which students to admit. And there does seem to be some evidence that eliminating the requirement of submitting a standardized test score has both enlarged and diversified the applicant pools at a lot of these schools. And so I would be really, really surprised if a large number of schools snap back to requiring standardized tests. So I think that might change. You know, I think that you know, we're going to continue to see what we're seeing right now, which is an increasingly bifurcated world of college and university haves and have-nots. You know, there's no sign that the brand strength of the most elite institutions is weakening. And so I think we see two very different worlds, one very small and highly selective and elite, and another that's very, very different. And I don't see any reason to expect that to change.
So, other thoughts? How's it going to, Jeff, this is right up your alley. What do you think? Big changes. What are the biggest changes? Brian talked about standardized tests. I think a lot of people are saying, you know, they're not going to come back to all these schools.
No, they're definitely not going to come back. I think some of the big brands that can easily still do this, and where the faculty may want it, where the trustees might want it, and where alumni might want it, will come back. But I think test optional is here to stay. I think that we're going to have a real conversation about what we want out of the college application. This idea that students are applying to 10 or 15 schools, you know, or even in this year, and even in a normal year, 8 to 10 schools. It's really created a very inefficient system. The fact that we ask for all these assets in the college application, when we know what matters most to success at most colleges is what you took in high school and what grade you got in high school. But yet we ask for all these other things especially again from the less selective institutions that don't have way many more applicants than they have seats. So that's where I think a lot of the conversation is going to center around how to make the system a little bit more efficient, and what do we really need to ask for in terms of the application. But I definitely agree with Brian that if anything came out from this past year, and this is true, by the way, across the economy, the rich got richer. You know, Amazon succeeded while the local retail shops failed. Wealthy people succeeded while, you know, the line workers didn't. And in higher education, the wealthiest and most selective institutions just got wealthier and more selective.
Mm-hmm. Not good for most.
No.
Yeah.
You know, I'm hoping, David, that I guess our somewhat newfound comfort with technology will help us recruit and admit students who might otherwise not have been in our radar screen, or more importantly, those students may not have had the wherewithal to know about certain opportunities for them. You know, I'm sure you see that with you're reaching alumni in ways that you've never been able to reach them. You're reaching donors, so I'm hoping that same sort of technological boom now that we're all a lot more familiar with will also help us reach students that we otherwise may not have reached, and contribute to the equity equation.
David, if I just add, I agree with Mary Beth. I mean, the problem though goes back to what I think Brian said earlier around the economic model. Low income first generation students are expensive to serve. They require a lot of institutional financial aid that many of these institutions can't afford. And so the financial model demands more students who could pay more of the bill.
Right, and the number of such families is declining as the
Yep.
as the cost of higher education in places like Union continues to go up quite quickly. So one of the questions that came in from a student, I know the student, fantastic student at Union College. It's a long preamble, but let me give you the gist of it. The gist of it is, as we're talking, Mary Beth, as you were just talking about this, talking about chances, opportunities to pivot. Josh, you're talking about understanding truly diversity among situations, the circumstances of students at college. This is an opportunity for colleges just to look at themselves and say, hey, why is our completion rate this low among certain populations? And not just that, but why are the alumni who are most excited, why is that not a random draw? Why is it correlated with certain characteristics of individuals? Are there things that you think colleges should be doing right now as we reset post-COVID?
Yeah, so I can jump in here, and I also think it's a good time to be a little provocative with the president of Union College, since we have the president here.
I thought you were going to say Brian at the beginning of that, but I guess
the way I think about this, and the students asking exactly the right question. It's wonderful to have student voices in here. That's great, and that's that we learn the most when we listen to our students. So the provocative thing, President Harris, is to ask, could you bring in, it kind of goes back to your scholarship kind of thing, in terms of setting your strategies and where you're going. I would ask that you bring into the conversation scholars of learning scientists, scholars of teaching and learning, because when you look at the research on learning, and we're learning a lot more about how people learn, and then you look at how we set up our colleges and universities, there's such a gap. Like, we do so many things that are opposite what you do if you're actually trying to align your educational organizational structures to that research. We do these big lecture classes, we do these high stakes exams, we focus on the grades, we do all these kind of things. We don't push enough in the relational parts of learning. So I think that this is an opportunity to look at that science, look at that scholarship, and address exactly what your student is talking about.
Yeah, I'll just say one of the first things I did when I got to Union, just in talking to students, and I asked folks, alums, what was really special about your Union experience? I asked students what's special, and what quickly became clear, and I knew this from my previous institution, I had a sense of it, there's actually small dollars that separate a full experience from a not full experience at the college. It's the fact that pre-orientation program costs $400. It's that you want to be on a lacrosse team, that costs a couple $100. There's a whole bunch of these things that rich families don't think twice about, but less affluent families, that's what stops you from having the full experience. So we actually started raising funds for that. The other piece, though, and I won't have a whole ad for Union College, though it's not a bad thing, is our strategic plan. The very first thing we say is we're developing every student, and it goes on. But the key is the every student, because what it means is when someone doesn't finish, when someone doesn't have an experience that's up to their expectations, then we could have done better. And so we're trying to analyze those to try and get a sense of why. So learning science is a huge piece of this, right?
So David, can I be provocative back? So I think Josh makes great points. Totally agree that the way we organize our teaching and learning at colleges and universities is not necessarily aligned with the way students learn. In fact, I would argue that we organize our colleges and universities, and this is the kind of thing I can say that because I'm no longer a president. Our colleges and universities are organized around faculty. They're not organized around students, which is not to say, and this goes back to Mary Beth's earlier point, this is not an industry in which the consumer necessarily knows best. I'm not suggesting that we give the students exactly what they want, but I am suggesting that our central question should be, what is best for the student? What is the most effective way for students to learn? What is the most effective way for students to be supportive? I don't see that in the way we organize our institutions, and I don't see that in the way that we conduct our teaching and learning. My sort of provocative question back is, what are the odds that a faculty is ever going to seriously do that? That is, you can point your finger at the president, but we both know that your ability as a president to shape what actually goes on in the classrooms and the laboratories and the studios is essentially limited to the bully pulpit, right? You can try to persuade, but it's virtually impossible for you to tell the faculty, stop teaching all those big lectures. Stop giving all those high stakes exams. So, where is the incentive in our current system for faculty members to take a step back and radically re-examine their own practices? I don't see those incentives existing right now, as long as we have the criteria for tenure that we do, the criteria for hiring that we do. If I'm an assistant professor at a good college, I'm not thinking about totally revamping higher education. I'm thinking about how I can get my next article published and what my teaching evaluations look like.
Right. I think I've seen that change a little bit, even in my time at Union College. So, and I said when we had a pre-call last week, said to Jeff, a lot of it was the news that came out of Ithaca College earlier this year about significantly reducing the size of the faculty. Is that, when I started this almost 3 years ago, I said the status quo isn't stable. And I think people understood, and yeah, okay. But Ithaca College, I think people said, hold on a second. Like, that's like us. We know those people. And so I had a faculty member in the humanities. There was something about connecting humanities and STEM on something. And I said in my office hours, which I have every month, faculty, staff, and students said, yeah, but I don't know I'm not sure if faculty would support that. And this professor said, you'd be surprised what we would support now compared to what we'd support in the past. So Brian, I agree with you. I think there's some change, but it may not be enough.
Yeah, and I'd like to try to answer Brian, because I think it's the right question. I hear this all the time. And so what I'd say to this is that, let's just say Union College, you have a lot of faculty who are past tenure. Yes, it's very hard with junior faculty when they're trying to get, but you have a lot of faculty who who are associate professors or full professors, and they're past that. They would love to innovate and advance and improve their student learning. Like, that's why they got into this, and they've been doing, and you talk to these professors and they're like, I don't want to keep doing what I've been doing because I see the limitations. But when you talk to professors, the hoops that they often have to jump through to get institutional support to innovate their teaching are incredible. Like, they have to go to 9 different places on the campus. It's small dollars. There's not a lot of status attached to it. They don't get the resources that they need. So I really do think that, the problem is not the faculty here. I think the problem is our institutions, that we've not poured the resources into our faculty who want to innovate. And there's enough of those folks. We don't have to worry about pulling the laggards behind. Just support the people who want to do the innovative stuff in their classrooms, and you'll make a lot of progress.
Let me just point out, because if I don't, faculty will tell me later. And I know, by the way, we shouldn't make pretend that there isn't innovation going on. There's a lot of innovation that goes on. A place like Union College, we don't have huge lectures. It just isn't something that occurs here. Sort of a big class is 30 or 40. There's more we could do, but some of those things are certainly happening.
And David, I agree with you 100% that innovation's happening. It's always interesting when, even when I was with the Chronicle, but even over the last couple of years, as I would go on this pre-COVID, obviously, when I was speaking at colleges, universities, I would always be welcomed by the provost or dean who would want to take me to show me the most innovative things happening on their campuses, right? Because normally they would want me to write about them at some point. And we would go to a corner of campus, and they would take me into a classroom or to one department, one classroom, and they said, isn't this great? And I'd look around and I'd be like, there's 5 students here or 10 students. And we would ask, well, why, if this is so innovative, why not expand it, bring it across the core of the academic core of the campus? And there would all be all these excuses, but one of the excuses I heard often, which was interesting, was, well, we don't want to be too different than fill in the blank, than McAllister, than Union, whatever your competitors were, or whoever you were trying to, especially around the rankings, try to move up in the rankings to be more like, right? And they felt that if they were too innovative, that they would actually be hurt in the eyes of prospective students and donors and the rankings. And that would come up frequently. Now, maybe you're going to tell me, and Brian will tell me as presidents, well, we don't care about the rankings, and maybe you're right, but it seems that there are many limiters on, scaling academic innovation, but it seemed like that was one of them. Maybe not the rankings, but not necessarily looking too different than your counterparts.
Yeah, I like to say the rankings are low validity, high impact. So we got to pay attention, even though I have lots of questions about them. Let me pivot a little bit. One of the questions we have as we think about higher ed, if we think of the challenges of higher ed moving forward, it's a question another student writes in. I don't know which student wrote this, I can't tell, is really, it fits in this notion about freedom of speakers, that you hear about indoctrination in higher ed, is, to what extent can and should higher ed either change to be a place where there's a freer exchange of ideas, or how do we better confront those who assert that we are a place that just indoctrinates students to a particular view? Any thoughts on that? Mary Beth, I bet you hear this sometimes when you're dealing with people in government and other places, right?
I hear it frequently, but why are my kids studying chemistry? That's all I want them to hear. They don't need to be hearing all this other stuff. I think of it more as a lay person. I just think college campuses are certainly, I believe, a bastion for free speech, whether that speech is liberal or conservative. What I find more concerning than anything is really the effort to shut down voices on campus. I think there are certain voices that clearly don't deserve a forum anywhere, but boy, I do not envy college presidents who have to make those difficult decisions on free speech. But I think the very crux of a liberal arts education is, let's hear all sides of an issue. Let's hear voices that we don't agree with. And I think from a liberal arts perspective, we are losing a lot when we completely shut off those options. And I'll talk to young people and they'll say, I was talking to a young person from one of the SUNY institutions, and they had Arthur Laffer, who was going to come to speak, the conservative economist. And the students, took chairs and cracked open the windows to keep him off. I said, do you have any idea who he is and what his economic theories are? And the response was, no, but we know he's a conservative. Really dangerous stuff.
Excellent. Others, any thoughts on this whole issue? It's certainly something that confronts us on a regular basis.
So I think it's important that we get our terminology right. I think with the exception of public universities and colleges, which are bound by certain laws about speech on public property, what we're talking about when we're talking about a university is really not free speech, but educational speech. And what kind of speech is educational? Colleges and universities are in the business of curating and limiting speech every single day in individual classrooms. A biology department is not obligated by any kind of free speech law to have creationism in their curriculum. And so the question is, I think for every college and university, for every faculty member, for every administrator, what speech should we have in our educational community that contributes to the education of our students? And that's where the question of a diversity of viewpoints really becomes important. I certainly believe that you learn more if you encounter people smart people, reasonable people, and humane people who disagree with you. Clearly, there are certain things that on all of our campuses are out of bounds, as they should be, and it's our right to declare where those boundaries are. But if those boundaries include someone whose political viewpoints happen to disagree with mine, then they are too narrow. But so to me, it's not, we get into trouble when we talk about free speech. I think we need to focus on educational speech and what kind of speech is educational at a university.
Yeah, and I got in trouble. And 100% agree with you, Brian. It got at least got people interested when I wrote an article. It's called something like "Why I'm Opposed to Free Speech on a College Campus," which was along the lines you're talking about with a maybe too provocative title. So just a quick comment. This is an easy one we get through. Someone says, "Hey, it'd be great if students were being surveyed and you're asking students about what they're experiencing and what they're looking forward to afterwards." And I just say at Union College, we're doing that. I was saying to the panel ahead of time, we have a Planning for Multiple Tomorrows group, and we've just come out, just looking at the data from faculty, staff, and students. It's been really interesting to see not only what we hear from each group, but as I said to the group recently, one of the key words is flexibility. The challenge we're seeing across these surveys is one person's flexibility is another person's constraint. And I think between, say, faculty and students sometimes, or staff, and that's going to be one of those things we're going to have to face coming out of this. That's going to create real challenges, I think, across higher ed. So let's go up to one. We'll go through a lot of these because we're running short on time. There's a lot of questions that have come in. I think, Jeff, you may have said, lose track of who said, I think you may have been the one who said, one of the things we're learning is that there's a lot of folks who don't need to be on campus. And so someone would push back on this and say, well, how do we think about the importance of being on campus across faculty, staff, and students? Is it only, is it the classroom, but otherwise doesn't matter so much? Or what are folks thinking about the importance of being on campus?
Well, I think, first of all, I meant mostly kind of not student-facing staff members, right? So, financial services, there's a lot of things that happen in the background, particularly on larger campuses, that could be done more remotely. There could be more hybrid pieces of what we're doing in higher ed. And when we think of hybrid now, we tend to think of what's happening in the classroom, but there could be more work done outside the classroom. For example, we were talking about, well, I think we might have been talking before we got on tonight about mental health, right? Mental health services. Some could be done through telemedicine, like we've seen this year. Career services. There's a lot of work around career services that can be done remotely. But in terms of the student experience, I agree. A residential campus is critically important, but there are so many students who want to do undergraduate research off of campus. They want to do internships or co-ops off campus. And the idea now that technology allows us to reach those students even when they're away from us, so that we allow much more flexibility for when they're there and when they're not. Now, some people might want that full-time residential experience for 4 years, but could we also offer other options, a low residency option, for example, where students are off campus as much as they're on campus doing other things, study abroad, undergraduate research, work, whatever it might be.
Excellent. Anyone else thoughts on the role of being on campus? Are there people to push HR, finance, and so forth? Do they need to be on campus, or is it okay if they never come to campus, or rarely? What do you think?
As I said, I spent my entire career at residential liberal arts colleges. I think there is no question that being in a living learning community has tremendous advantages and is impossible fully to replicate at a distance. So I don't think the question is so much whether being on campus has value, interacting with students and faculty and staff in that way has value. I think it does. For me, the question is whether it is just affordable if we're serious about dramatically increasing access to higher education in the United States. It's a great model, but it's an expensive model. And so if we're really serious about increasing access and reducing some of those inequities that exist right now, we're going to have to figure out a way to provide a really good education at a different scale and at a different price point. And so sure, if every college and university in the country had the resources of Harvard, who wouldn't want to be on the campus? But the reality is that most institutions don't, and most students can't afford to pay. And as Jeff said, increasingly students are not in a situation in their lives where they can just stop and move to a campus. And so for me, the question isn't about whether being on campus is good. It's great. The question is, what other models can we come up with that provide a really good education, but don't require that cost? Because the cost of that, high touch, big physical plant, low student faculty ratio is what is going to drive a lot of these institutions out of business.
So just to push on that, earlier, Jeff said it's, this has been great for the haves, if you will, COVID. And do you see, Brian, as some people do, X years down the road where X is not a large number, there's really a small group of schools that look like the ideal and a whole bunch of other schools who just can't afford it. And so have to compromise on the things we'd ideally have. Sort of what I keep saying, it's what's happening in K-12 to some extent.
I absolutely worry about that. My worry is that there's going to be a small group of colleges that are and universities, the equivalent of luxury cars.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll be available for a small number of people in the population. But what about everybody else? And I think we need to be spending less time worrying about what Harvard is doing and more time worrying about how we educate a lot more people on a much bigger scale at a much higher level. Harvard,
David, I think what
Harvard is
Brian
not
is
going to solve these problems.
I think what Brian is saying is absolutely on target, because the demographic cliff that you mentioned earlier is not just a one-time event. It's systemic. I mean, we're in a period of incredibly low birth rates in this country, and it's not going to change suddenly, right? And so unless we figure out a way to increase demand for higher education, which I talked about earlier, right? Adult students, lifelong learning and things like that. But if we think that this model of 18 to 22 years old, sending them off to college, full-time residential, there's just going to be, and I hate to use this word, fewer customers. And the demographics of those customers, again, a lot fewer people who can pay even anything. Is just going to be larger numbers of those students. And so it's going to be really hard, I think, for some of these and I'm not a doom and gloom guy about all these colleges going to go out of business, because I actually think that when forced, they're going to think of new business models. But if we think the business model of a McAllister and Union is the one that everyone should follow, I just think it's going to be a recipe for disaster.
Right. The challenge, of course, is, and Brian said it earlier, the challenge is that we're not known for changing quickly. That was what was striking. When we had massive constraint of March 2020, we did, but we're not necessarily known as places that quickly say, oh my God, this isn't stable, let's change a huge percent. So that really doesn't bode well for lots of schools, if that's true.
And you also, a school like Union also has a cohort of families and parents who do want it all, who do want the full experience, who do want the best facilities, who do want, everything that a well-resourced college can offer. And then you're balancing that against, yeah, that's great, but only 20% of my families can really afford that sort of model. So how do you give families what they want in a sustainable way? And I think absolutely, if I saw anything by representing 100 colleges, there's no one size that fits every college, and there are haves and have-nots. What I think is, what I'm heartened by is that the one thing that is pretty similar is really their willingness to, and their focus on students, that they might be serving a different type of student, but increasingly, certainly more so than when I was a college student, I think this notion of student success, how do we get them to succeed, I think was common amongst all of my colleges, whether it was Union, Columbia, or Little St. Rose in Albany.
Excellent. Thanks. So let me pivot it to the question here. So Brian, you definitely got people's attention when you talked about the shift that you saw in McAllister, and we see other places, the humanities declining. So given that we all believe, I think we all believe the humanities need to be an important piece moving forward of liberal arts colleges, I guess one thing you said is break down the departments, but are there other things we'd say about how the future of liberal arts colleges can continue to have strong humanities? given the concerns of the customer, as we've said,
Yeah.
changing focus on value proposition and so forth.
I think there just has to be a real clear connection to the marketplace. You know, we'd like to think that we don't have to think about that, but we do. And I think there can be clear connections. You know, I'd be investing a whole heck of a lot in my career offices, and I'd be networking with every alumni who ever came out with an English degree and is now doing something in a different field and doing quite well. I think families would embrace being able to study what they have a passion for if they understand there are pathways. And it's not enough anywhere more to say, don't worry, we give you, it's there, you have all the tools. I think you have to walk them through where those tools will lead you.
Yeah, where the bread comes out. Brian, what are your thoughts? You sort of dealt with this again firsthand.
You know, I think we're starting to see some really interesting cross-disciplinary experimentation that both improves student learning and makes the humanities relevant in a way that perhaps a traditional major does not. So, you know, for instance, you know, I would love it if every student who majored in computer science took a class in ethics. And we're beginning to see either team taught classes or pairs of classes where you have a computer scientist and an ethicist who are working together. You know, we've become a little bit like Frankenstein's monster, where our ability to do things has gotten way ahead of our ability to think about whether they're worth doing. And I think that's where the humanities come in. So I think if we can seriously break out of the restriction of the traditional curriculum and the traditional major, there are really meaningful ways that the humanities can be interwoven into the education of students who major in STEM disciplines or in economics. And I actually think those students are interested in taking those classes. And to Mary Beth's point, I also think that every department on every college campus now needs to be thinking about some degree of career preparation for students. You know, one of the things we did at Macalester was completely reorganize the career development office and have a person assigned to every division and put that person actually in the building with the faculty. So a student didn't even have to go over to some other place. If you were an English major and you wanted to talk to someone in the career development office about what you do with an English major, that person would be spending a certain number of hours a week right there. And so I think every department needs to think, given the current economic environment, given current economic inequities, about the fact that the vast majority of students don't have the luxury of not thinking about a job. And so we don't have the luxury as educators of not thinking about that with them.
Excellent. So let me switch to technology. One of the things I love to talk about always. One of the questions is, look, when we think about future liberal arts colleges post-COVID, what are the technologies that exist that we've learned that maybe people aren't aware of, but more people should know that'll be key to success? We all know Zoom. I don't know how many of us, I never heard of Zoom 3 years ago. I don't know if Zoom existed 3 years ago, but everyone now knows it. Are there other technologies that you've seen, and Josh, you in particular, given what you do, that we should know about that'll be helpful?
Sure. I mean, I think it starts with the realization that the old distinctions between residential learning and online learning, those are all disappearing. It's just learning. And we need to figure out a way that our institutions can be resilient and our learners can be resilient when things happen. We know that this is not going to be the last disruption. It's not going to be the last pandemic. We're going to have extreme weather. We're going to need to be able to stay resilient as we go on. So I think that the question is, the students coming back to campus, everyone wants to come back. The question is, what do they do when they're back on campus? So many, and maybe Union College is different, but throughout most of higher education, there's a lot of lecturing going on, right? Do we really need to do all that with what we know, with what the technologies we have? I don't really think so. I guess the last mind shift I really want to push, and this is for people in technology, faculty, people who are presidents. I feel like our jobs is we work for the students who have the least advantages. If we conceive our jobs as that's our job, is we work for them. We work for the students with the least resources. If we can figure out how to have their student experience be successful, it will work for everyone else. And I think that's a shift that we need to talk about more. We need to be fine to talk about when it's not working. We're always celebrating our successes, but we really need to get out when it's just not working for some of our students, understand that and work that problem.
Excellent. So we're getting towards the end, and a faculty member wrote in, I'm going to paraphrase it, so don't worry, faculty member. I know this is not what you said. There's the A word in higher ed. The A word is assessment. So as we think about all of this, how do we know if we're on the right path? What are some keys to assessment at different levels in higher ed? What are some places maybe even where you think we ought to think about assessment a little more than we do? There's obviously the annual, did students sign up to come to your school? But it's got to be other things as well.
Well, I think, David, we need to move beyond kind of the high stakes testing, not only getting into college, but throughout college, and really put much more of a focus on student learning, and where I would like the focus to be on the transfer of that learning beyond the classroom and what learning that happens outside the classroom, beyond the college, beyond the boundaries of the college, right? There were so many times when I was reporting my last book where I would sit in job interviews with seniors in college or new college graduates, and they would have a really hard time explaining what they learned on an internship or in a particular class on campus. They could always talk about what they did.
Mm-hmm.
They were very good at describing the bullets that were on their LinkedIn profile or on their resume about what they did, but they were not as, but to the person interviewing them, that was less relevant than what they learned and how that could be applied to this different situation, meaning the job they want. And I think sometimes in our focus on getting the grade, or over the last year in terms of reporting this book, it was always about getting in. It was always about getting into college, not about what we wanted to do while we were there or what what our goals were. And so I think that if we reduce this pressure on high stakes testing, focus more on student learning and how to translate that, to me, that will increase the value of the degree over the long term, because students will be able to transfer that learning throughout their lifetime.
Yeah, yep. Excellent. Sort of dog chases bus, dog catches bus, dog thinks, what do I do now? Kind of, gotcha. Okay. We're getting close to the end. I wonder if there's alumni. We haven't talked about alumni that much yet. So an alum wrote in and asked, what role should alumni be playing in the school of the future? Is there more that alums should be doing? Obviously, donations is something that people always think about, annual participation rates, but are there more things we should be asking?
Yeah. I'll jump in here as the online learning person. That alumni are your learners. Like that's the kind of thing that if you go to Union College, you're a Union College learner your whole life. And that Union College and Dartmouth College and all of our liberal arts need to be offering learning for our graduates at every stage of their life. We can't just be having them come back for hockey games or whatever. So that's what we have to do. I do think if we invest in that, it will return back to us.
Excellent. So
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mary Beth.
I would just also add, I think they could be your best billboard for a proud alumni base. But I also think their alumni need to be supportive and enlightened about the need to change, that the campus may not be what it was 15 years ago, and that's a good thing.
Excellent. Okay. I have a closing comment, but any last comments from anybody before I move to close?
I just want to underscore Josh's point about the lecture. I think one of the really interesting discussions we need to have in higher education going forward is about whether the traditional lecture, given the sheer cost in dollars and time, how precious that face-to-face time is in a classroom, do we really want to spend it with the faculty member as simply an information delivery system? Are there better ways to use that time? And has this experience in the pandemic taught us anything about what we can take out of that classroom time so that we use that precious classroom time for the most useful and impactful kind of learning? I think that's a really fascinating question.
Yeah, I remember a faculty member said to me once, the first flipped classroom was called the book, right? So it used to be at the lecture because there weren't enough books around, but then people could read some of it and you could use classroom for other things. Great. So let me thank you all for spending some time with us this evening. One of the great things, there are a lot, but one of the great things about this pandemic is it introduced us to Zoom. It meant that we could have events like this with folks from across the country who, you know, you're wonderful. I'm sure you'd love to help us, but you've busy lives. You wouldn't be able to join us if you had to come on campus for this. So I want to thank you for taking the time and for being with us for an enlightening conversation. I also just reflect on how wonderful it is that we are thinking about life after the pandemic, as opposed to X more years of what we're dealing with now. But I'll just say part of what I struggle with, and I was talking to our board chair the other day, part of the challenge is that we have a limited window to make the kind of changes we're talking about before we end up back in the old normal, and everybody's tired. And so just trying to get through the days. And so I hope we in higher ed are able to live up to a lot of the aspirations you set for us. I know at Union College, we're going to do our absolute best. And I thank you for helping us to better get a sense of what those things are. So with that, thanks to our panelists, thanks to the over 100 people who are in the audience. I wish everybody a good evening, and I look forward to seeing you on campus or virtually soon. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, David.